So as we ask the big questions and and really ponder them, who are we as a people? Where are we going, and how can we best face the challenges that so face us? Lincoln is a sober and a somber guide. I believe he's our greatest president, not for the usual reasons we find necessarily in older textbooks or political speeches. His greatness lies in mediating a very messy middle ground in an increasingly polarized society. We've been talking about resilience. We've had some wonderful talks over the last few weeks about individual resilience, and I'd like to offer this talk as a reflection on our collective resilience as a society, and perhaps the breakdown of that resilience, and how we might find our way forward. As I was preparing this talk, Iris sent me a wonderful article on Lincoln, which asked why Lincoln's stock has fallen in our culture, why he is not as revered as he once was. The author was writing in 2003, so 20 years ago, and he could still conclude that most Americans still saw Lincoln and the founders as admirable but imperfect. This is not really the case anymore. Small but vocal and growing groups at both ends of the political spectrum they really malign our greatest president. And we must work harder to recover his legacy, to teach our children why he continues to matter. And in some important ways, this is perhaps a paradox, we've been too easy on him and perhaps on ourselves. Many Southerners and Southern sympathizers, of course, hated Lincoln, calling him an abolitionist. And many in the North, including the abolitionists, at times despised him as a Southern sympathizer. The abolitionists looked with horror at Lincoln's willingness to compromise with the South. To preserve the Union, Lincoln was willing that perhaps slavery might continue in the South for another generation, perhaps more. As long as slavery was confined to the South, this was the hard line that Lincoln and the Republicans had. No expansion of slavery into those Western territories and eventually states. So it wasn't just fire-eating Southerners who wanted secession. Abolitionists, too, in many famous cases, preferred to split up rather than to share a country with this abomination of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolitionist of them all, had long called for a referendum among the free states to peacefully dissolve the Union. Lincoln and the Republicans thought that that would be a disaster. Now, why would that be? What's the big deal about union anyway? What if, after freeing ourselves from Great Britain, all 13 colonies had continued more or less independent under a weak umbrella confederation as existed before our Constitution? Or what if a couple of generations later, someone like Lincoln had not emerged and the South had seceded? Would a free North have been able to share a stable border with a slave-breeding aristocracy? Our subsequent history, our world today, would be really different. For example, think of America's role in the two world wars. The positive, indeed crucial role that we played there. Many of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents fought in one of those wars. Would we have been able to play that role if we had not been melded together by the Constitution, and if we had not survived the trial by fire of the Civil War? If we had split up into two nations, would we have been able to avoid squabbling and fighting with each other, weakening each other and ourselves for some opportunistic outside power to exploit? For all its flaws, union has been utterly necessary. Many disagree with me, especially anti-Lincoln voices of the right and of the left. The most extreme anti-Lincoln right-wing view sees Lincoln as a psychopathic dictator, right? And often would explicitly call the Ku Klux Klan harmless and patriotic citizens. But even in a more diluted form, some folks on the right who would never speak well of the Klan still have a very negative view of Lincoln. Former US Representative Ron Paul, for example, has called the Civil War senseless, saying Lincoln could easily have ended slavery without the Civil War. Lincoln's real aim, according to Paul, was to, quote, get rid of the original intent of the Republic. In other words, he thinks Lincoln didn't really care for the founders or for the Constitution. So that's, in summary, of kind of the anti-Lincoln right. Then on the anti-Lincoln left, Lincoln was too soft on slavery. He was too conciliatory to Southern interests. One such author spent 600 pages to demonstrate that Lincoln was first and always a white supremacist. Even more influential is Howard Zinn's famous book, A People's History of the United States. This book teaches that the Constitution was a sordid betrayal of democracy. And for Zinn, the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln and the Democratic Party of Jefferson Davis were morally equivalent, as were the US and Nazi Germany during World War II. Zinn's position on Lincoln would be very similar to that of the abolitionists of the time. Lincoln's willingness, at least at first, to compromise with the South on slavery made him just as bad as Jeff Davis. Zinn is also on the same page as William Lloyd Garrison on the Constitution. Garrison famously called the Constitution a covenant with death and with hell. Now, as you can see, those anti-Lincoln voices of the right and anti-Lincoln voices of the left really contradict each other in many ways. But nevertheless, these camps have traction. They have growing traction. Social media has amplified a white supremacy narrative that I naively thought was dead and buried. And Zinn's book has become, in California and elsewhere, a textbook in many US history courses. Also, a range of universities also use this book in their courses. Many in Berkeley, where I grew up, view the American flag as a fascist symbol, or at least as a Republican symbol, which for them is kind of the same thing. The danger is that a misinformed pseudo-debate, where these two extremes are talking past each other, corrodes and erodes the middle ground, corrodes and erodes our resilience, and thereby any possibility for a real debate about Lincoln's legacy. So I believe it's up to the pro-Lincoln folks, progressive and conservative, to make a stronger case. This group tends to glide over the most serious criticisms leveled at Lincoln. But facing these criticisms head on will make our argument stronger. First, the charge that Lincoln was a Southern sympathizing white supremacist. Anti-Lincoln folks on the left often bring up his support of colonization of freed slaves to Africa. Another real big talking point would be the really messy and compromised nature of the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed only the slaves of states and territories that were at the time in rebellion. So some slaves just were not freed explicitly by that Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it's worth dwelling on this because this is not something that makes it into elementary history textbooks, and perhaps it's a little bit too advanced. But it's certainly, I've noticed over and over again with my students, this is often the first time they hear these things. And when they do, that first time they hear, oh, wait, colonization? The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't this utopian thing that we thought it was when we learned about it in 5th grade. When they learn that, they kind of shoot towards kind of an anti-Lincoln left direction. And we can understand why. We want our heroes to be on the high moral ground. But it's precisely that moral high ground that Lincoln could not afford. Lincoln feared that, as he's in office, as he's facing secession, as he's trying to live up to his oath to the Constitution, he feared that if he had freed the slaves when the war started immediately, then the border states would go over to the Confederacy, the war could have been lost. He was performing a delicate balancing act. Abolitionists, of course, in this scenario had the moral high ground. But remember, the abolitionists cared little or nothing for the Union. And Lincoln's course saved the Union. So we really are dealing with some hard trade-offs here. Lincoln knew the wrong of slavery, and he doggedly pursued an anti-slavery policy. For the abolitionists, of course, this policy was far too little. But for the fire-eating Southerners, it was the end of the world. We must also take seriously the charge, and this comes mostly from the anti-Lincoln right, that Lincoln was going against the Constitution. Southerners and Southern sympathizers in the North charged that in suspending habeas corpus, Lincoln had made himself a dictator. So habeas corpus is this ancient principle of English law, which we Americans picked up, which protects us against arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. Lincoln justified this action as a wartime necessity. And he cited the Constitution, which specifically states that suspension of habeas corpus is allowed in case of rebellion. Now, most pro-Lincoln people do not face directly this curbing of civil liberties. It's a drastic and a draconian action, right? And some instead search for higher motives that Lincoln had. Constitutional scholars argue that Lincoln, in his heart, rejected the Constitution and the rule of law, but he couldn't say so openly because that would undermine his legitimacy. Now, these left-leaning scholars are kind of able to reach this conclusion because they themselves are in some ways lukewarm on the Constitution. So we have this weird situation where pro-Lincoln scholars and anti-Lincoln conservatives or libertarians like Ron Paul disagree about most things, but they agree that Lincoln didn't care about the Constitution. But Lincoln was a hard-headed lawyer who had taken an oath to the Constitution. We must better understand what he was trying to do. He knew the wrong of slavery, but he also knew that the unintended consequences of our good intentions could make the wrong worse. This is a perennial challenge for us. How can we better balance that essential fire for change and for justice with an equally essential sobriety and an awareness of the law of unintended consequences? Our challenges today are in many ways very different from those that faced Lincoln and his generation. We do not really risk splitting along the Mason-Dixon line anymore, or even, into coastal and heartland enclaves. We are polarized, and we are getting more so, and this carries dangers. But before the Civil War, we were these United States, these states united, plural. And now, of course, we are the United States, singular. We're together, whether we like it or not. We don't risk becoming two nations anymore. We risk succumbing to the universal weakness of democratic forms of government as polarized factions corrode and erode societies and possibly a dictatorship emerges. We must study that historical relationship between democracy and dictatorship. After the French Revolution of 1789, it took a decade before Napoleon seized power in a coup, a military coup. In Russia in 1917, the process took only 7 months, from czar to liberal democracy to dictatorship, 7 months flat. And of course, the most famous example of them all, Germany. From the fall of the Kaiser through the Weimar Republic to Hitler, 15 years had passed. Now, when our Constitution was written, the French Revolution hadn't even happened yet. Our founders studied carefully older examples of factionalism tearing ancient societies apart. And we Americans have reaped the fruits of this Constitution. We have steered clear of that cycle from monarchy to democracy to dictatorship that has so plagued other parts of the world. Is our Constitution perfect? Definitely not. But it is not an accident that we have, despite our youth as a country, the oldest written Constitution in the world. Yet today we are divided, and of course so divided that many of us wonder if the United States will follow that same historical example, so followed by the French, the Germans, the Russians, and so many others. Rival political tribes here in America accuse each other of being fascist. And both sides see ourselves as the stalwarts of democracy, and sometimes indeed of goodness itself, against a malevolent or a deluded foe. I think that the truth is less tribal than that, and also more disturbing than that. I believe we need a wrenching and necessary synthesis, not to solve or end the culture wars or anything like that, but to find common ground, to find the common good. I find in Lincoln a guide towards this less tribal and more disturbing truth, which really could give us the potential to renew ourselves. I know it's much easier said than done. And what I emphatically do not mean is that we should brush January 6th under the rug, or that we should all grit our teeth and sing Kumbaya. I'd like to give one quick example of what I do mean. We could go in many productive directions here, but to conclude, I want to focus on just one example: navigating the conflict around the teaching of history in public schools. In many ways, Zinn's book, again, a textbook in many parts of California and elsewhere, serves as an essential corrective to the kind of mom and apple pie versions of history of most previous history textbooks. Zinn emphasizes the kaleidoscope of Americans who were not white and male. And he also focuses on the late 19th century and early 20th century labor wars. Really important, really necessary. But he also asserts that the Constitution was a sham. Also asserts that Lincoln and Jeff Davis were essentially the same guy. The US and Nazi Germany in World War II, same thing. All phonies. No, this is not the way to raise our children. This is disastrous ethical and historical illiteracy. So should we then side with those who would like to whitewash the sordid aspects of our history, especially around slavery and its continuing reverberations? Of course not. But it does require that we work harder to make the pro-Lincoln case, that we appeal to the messy middle ground, that we, dare I say, reacquire a respect for the Constitution, and dare I say, even to take the flag back. For all its flaws, we have something special here. Is our world, our history, better than what it might have been? Has it been worth the price that so many have paid with their blood, sweat, tears, very lives? Some questions we can only answer one human mind and heart at a time. But some questions we must answer collectively. Lincoln sleeps well tonight on planet Earth. And with his example, we do have the opportunity to renew this great and very flawed republic. And we'll do it together or not at all. Lincoln found the way forward for his time, and so must we for ours.